Hello, and welcome to Inversant Insights. I'm your host, Heidi Hancock, CEO of Inversant. Thanks to everyone joining us live and catching the replay. This is our first insights of the new year. 2021 is going to be a good one. On today's show, we're tackling the student debt crisis and how donors can help close that gap. The gaps between massive student debt, equity, and access to higher education. In the US alone, college graduates owe $1 trillion on their student loans. That's larger than the gross domestic product of 175 countries. In fact, no company in the Fortune 500 produces even half that much in annual revenue. To say that student loan debt is a crisis is an understatement. And that's why I'm excited to welcome today's guest. Joining me today are Bill Moses, the Managing Director of the Kresge Foundation, education program supporting post-secondary access and success for low-income first-generation and underrepresented students. Hey, Bill, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Raquan Wedderburn, the Senior Program Coordinator of the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. Raquan is the co-author of Majoring in Debt, Why Student Loan Debt is Growing the Racial Wealth Gap and How Philanthropic Can Help. Hey, Raquan. Dr. Don Medley, Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Don is the creator and champion of the Warrior Way Back program, the first national student debt forgiveness program. All right, everyone, are you ready to dive in? Great, let's jump right into today's topic. So the student debt crisis exists not because individual bad choices were made, but because of a series of systemic choices that leave little space for making good choices. I'm curious, from your different perspectives, what does that system look like?
Hi, and thank you, Heidi. Thanks for having me on this morning. So your question, you probably asked it a little nicer than I probably would. And I kind of default to why should we care about student loan debt? I think a lot of people historically and on average probably understand investment in higher education as something to pay off and something that many students take on in the course of financing their higher education. And then their, wages and economic growth that they have in their life based on going to college usually provides them with an opportunity to pay off their debt and pay off their loan. And although outcomes have varied by gender and race, historically that is true, that generations of Americans have successfully financed their education with student loan debt and reaped the benefits of this higher lifetime income. But I think today, the landscape is a little different and the calculation is less clear for many students. There are a lot of factors that have contributed to the challenge of guaranteeing that students benefit from a college degree, rapidly rising tuition, housing, healthcare costs, as well as complexities in the labor market, varying program quality, and even the lack of information around financing and just the pure economic impact of debt leaves a lot of students to make less than informed choices that ultimately damages their financial security and impacts our shared economic prosperity. So this is what I'm seeing from my perspective and from the research that we put into our brief.
Thank you, Raquan. That's a great, setting a great set framework that we can start to discuss. Dawn, what does it look like from your perspective?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to add, and I agree with everything that Raquan said, essentially what you're seeing is kind of the tug between state and federal. So over the course of the past 25 years, we have seen institutions, especially publicly supported institutions, have to raise their costs because state legislatures have underfunded them. And so what has happened is that consumer cost has been passed on to students. Students have not seen an increase in the federal student aid that they're receiving or the budget. So there's a bigger gap in there, and students are having to keep filling that gap with loan money. The other kind of confounding factor with that is we see a lot of parents now who are sending their children to college and they're still paying on their own student debt. And so it's become a multi-generational problem that I think is systemic because we have underfunded higher education at both the state and then the individual student at the federal level.
That's a deep issue, especially when we're starting to look not only at levels between state and federal, but also familial levels too. We've got multiple generations all incurring debt and attending school at the same time. Bill, what does it look like from your perspective?
Well, I would agree also with Dawn and Raquan, and I add a couple of other wrinkles. And of course, what Dawn was talking about, this reduction in state support, comes because virtually every state in the country has what's called a balanced budget amendment. These were all imposed in the last 40 or 50 years. And that means you can never borrow in bad times. So what happens is that you ratchet down support for public institutions because the only part of the state budget that people will borrow for individually is for college. They're not going to borrow frankly, to use the public health system or to borrow to drive down the freeway. They might pay a toll, but they're not going to borrow for it. But they will borrow for college. And I did want to add that college is still a great thing. The return on investment is terrific. If you get an associate degree, you're going to make on average $250,000 more over a lifetime. And if you get a BA, you're going to make on average $1 million more. The challenge, however, is if you finish or not. Because if you don't finish, you end up with sort of the worst of both worlds. You don't have that credential that yields a higher income, and you often have significant amounts of debt. Now, the challenge with that student debt is that it reinforces age-old issues of inequities within our society, of things like redlining, so that certain people, particularly communities of color, haven't had the chance to build up the kind of wealth that allows them not to borrow to go to college. So they're already starting sort of behind the starting line when they get to college. And then once you graduate, or once you complete your engagement with higher education, I should say, it becomes harder to create your own household because you have this debt over your head. You can't easily buy a car, easily buy a house, easily pay for daycare. It also, I think, tends to make students make choices that are safer. They don't want to go maybe into the humanities and social sciences because they hear that STEM is more likely to yield higher incomes. That's not a bad choice. It's just that it's often making people choose things they don't necessarily want to do. They tend to, I think, do less exploration. They tend to focus more on high compensated careers rather than maybe careers a society needs, like school teachers. And so people don't want to take risk when they have so much on the line because of student debt. And there are other aspects of the student debt problem that just make it harder for students then to go back, maybe if they have dropped out to go to college, because they're currently paying off the debt. And as Dawn said, they're often paying off debt while their parents are paying off student debt. So it all tends to sort of reinforce the challenges that students today face when they graduate. Or not.
And it sounds like, one of the things that we're talking about is that student debt is not just about students. It's not necessarily just a student problem. It really affects many different layers, which kind of makes that statement, it's not just about student loan debt. We started to talk a little bit about some of the other structural issues that it is about. It is about access. It is about equity. It is about who gets to complete sometimes. Can you, Raquan, again, that seems to tie right into your work, and how can we start to address some of these underlying biases that are inherent on who is incurring debt?
That's right. I mean, for folks struggling, paying off the debt requires them to make financial trade-offs and make difficult choices. Oftentimes, they prioritize the student loan debt relative to other types of debt and other household needs, just because, a lot of folks feel fearful that student loan debt, not paying it could have negative consequences to their financial security. So a lot of people prioritize their debt, paying off the debt, and it really leaves them with little left over to save for emergencies, which was, as we've I'm sure many of you guys know that's incredibly important in a situation like this pandemic we're facing, where a lot of folks who focus on paying down their debts just didn't have the emergency savings. But even beyond short-term emergency savings, folks also were faced with a decision between saving for retirement and other long-term investments. So, we're really seeing the consequences of student loan debt beyond the individual and impacting their financial lives in general, because, a debt is just one part of the balance sheet. It's one part of a family's or a household's, financial concerns. Like, a lot of people have a lot of other things that they're concerned about. And so student debt really impacts it. And we see disparities for people of color and for women and for low income borrowers. But there's some really great statistics in our paper, but we really talk a lot about the way that it impacts saving for retirement in particular. And just one stat that came to mind just now is that those with student loan debt at age 30 on average have half the retirement of savings of those without. And so when you're thinking about how is this impacting race, how is this impacting, gender and other abilities and things like that, like, not having a lack of retirement savings and being able to confidently save for your future is a huge barrier, and it intensifies the wage gap and the tough choices that people are, making. It even happens in the presence of a student loan balance payment that might seem lower. Like, folks are even if the loan payment isn't a huge percentage of, the payments that they have to make in their life, just the presence of the student loan debt even looms over the financial decisions because, folks are really fearful of that, the impact to their credit score, the wage garnishing, when you face that, it seems like an obvious choice to pay down your debt versus saving. And so, and like Bill's point, it's affecting career decisions. People are noting that their debt is determining which careers they pursue, and that even students are looking for employers that offer student loan assistance as a benefit, which is something that only about 8% of employers are doing right now, but more and more people are requesting this and wanting to see it. So I think that it's quite obvious by the amount of people that have stake in this, employers and things like that, that student loan debt is an issue that impacts beyond just, you as a borrower. It really impacts your financial security and your health and well-being. And that's why I'm glad we're here today to talk about this. Thank you.
Yeah, and you touched on it, and I'm curious from all of your perspectives, but Dawn, you mentioned, there are differentiators in race. Race debt is handled differently by race. It's also student loan debt has a different face across racial lines. Gender lines, also women treat debt and they approach finance differently. How are we seeing this play out in our different realms? Dawn, how do you see it in school? And Bill, how do you see it as an overall organization that's really designed to make some systemic changes?
Well, I think you bring a really good point to this discussion, because we see that Black women are disproportionately affected by the student loan debt that they are taking on. And one of the things that Bill mentioned early on is, students are making career choices, major choices, and deciding, what their life is going to be like based on what they think the return on investment is. I back that up even one step further. Students are making the decision to not go to college because of student loans. And so we see a lot of students, even though a baccalaureate degree or an associate's degree is a really good investment, we see students being very worried about incurring student debt because they see the burden that their family has been under. They know what, maybe they have cousins, friends, aunts, uncles who have been affected by that. And when students take on that debt and they don't graduate, everybody sees that it really does disproportionately affect their quality of life. And so we have students, especially young Black men, who make the choice to, try to earn versus learn. So they're making a choice not to borrow money because they're afraid that they may not be successful. And then what does that do? That incurs debt. And actually in higher education, we talk about it a lot, because if we bring a student into the institution, they incur that debt and they aren't successful successful and they don't graduate, we've actually done more harm to them than if they had not borrowed that money in the first place, because it does have ripple effects for the rest of their life. And one of the things is if a parent owes student loan debt, we talked a little bit about them borrowing money for their children to go to school, but even backing that up, it's going to affect where they can afford to live. And we know that we fund schools based on property taxes. So that can have an impact on the family. It may have an impact on whether or not they're able to take trips or vacations or do enrichment activities with their children because they're having to pay this student loan burden. And so basically they may be putting off life. They may be putting off health choices. You know, we're seeing students who are moving back in with families because they can't afford to make student loan payments, other loan payments, and have, you know, a type of life that they'd like. So it does disproportionately affect first generation low income students. And a lot of those students are students, African American students, Hispanic students. And so we do see a lot of that within the community, and it really is widespread. And so I think as a nation and as institutions that want to support students, we kind of have to run at this head on and really take steps to address it.
And Bill, what does it look like from your perspective? How do you see the different striations?
Yeah, I think this is all, everything we've heard really is true. And I think this sort of long-term corrosive effect of having more and more people having to depend on more and more debt in order to get what is critically important to be prosperous in the 21st century, which is to have a post-secondary credential. And I think one of the things that Raquan mentioned was things like credit score. Remember, you cannot discharge your student loan debt, for example, in bankruptcy. So if you start to fall behind, let's say because you've been affected by COVID, now there are temporary holds and things like that that are occurring right now, but you could imagine situations in which you can't pay your student loans. If you start falling behind in that, your credit rating goes down. If your credit rating goes down, it goes back to what we just heard from Don. Then you can't get a good, you might not be able to rent from in a better neighborhood. You might not be able to buy a house because you can't afford the payments because you're not getting the preferred interest rates. So these things all have this accumulating effect, and we're often typically asking the least among us, the people with the fewest financial resources, to pay the greatest price for this critically important need. I think the other thing that's interesting is that we hear a lot of complaints from people saying, I don't see why we need to reduce student debt. I did it myself. I worked my way through college. The fact is that the price of college today is much higher than it was back in the 1970s. And so not only is it higher, in many cases, the people who talk about working their way through college actually didn't have to pay very much or anything in some cases. I think my stepmother, who supports policies that can help students, but she remembers when she didn't have to pay any tuition cost to go to the University of California in the 1970s. So things like that have changed over time. And that's affecting the way students today are living and how people, in their 20s and 30s are living. It's not the same world as people who are living, who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, remember.
And that puts that's a huge piece. So, and Raquan, you have stated in your paper, you've made some wonderful suggestions. This is a huge issue that we need to tackle. And it's not just about debt, but it does touch on all of these different areas of our culture and of our society of who gets to go where. Again, access to credit ratings, availability. I'm just, I'm kind of gobsmacked about how this goes on. I can, just even carrying a student loan significantly shifts your own credit rating and your ability. Just because you're a risk, if you've got a student loan, you are a higher risk of doing that. So, I completely understand the reluctance to enter into that kind of piece. But with all of these issues that are at hand, we've got three folks here that have some good ideas on how to get started from different places. Raquan, can you tell us some of the places that we might start to address some of these issues?
Sure. So for the way that we kind of addressed it and looked at it is grounding it in household financial security. So when, looking at solutions for the student loan debt crisis, we focus on our financial security outcomes and really taking into account the loan burdens on household finances. So, in an absence of an opportunity for the really huge systemic policy change that I think a lot of folks are hinting around that we need. We also looked at some of the financial security outcomes that are impacted. And, a part of that is addressing the true circumstances of today's students. And like Dawn said, and like I'm sure Bill knows, the typical student today isn't just an 18 to 20-year-old, first time student just out of high school, but it's often older students with families who are the primary earner for their family. And so they're in a really different financial situation. And so we look to provide options for really importantly, like many mentioned, non-completers, those who are not getting the benefit from the wage increases that you would see when you earned your degree. And in that area, disproportionately represented, you see Black and brown people, you see women. And so we thought that was a good place to look. And so to that vein, we prioritized equity for those people and those borrowers. And like many folks said, low balance loans were also a huge area that we looked into that can make a large part, a big difference of, 60% of the folks who have student loan debt and are facing delinquency from not paying their student loan debt are those who have balances of $10,000 or less, primarily because that they haven't been able to complete their degree. But this is a huge area that we thought that we could see growth and change in the area if we attack that part of students.
That seems like a significant part. I just want to reiterate what you said, 60%, and we're talking more than $1 trillion in debt. 60% is held by people with less than 10,000 or 10,000 or less in debt, and that at highest risk of default. That is, if you think about how many people does that translate to, Dawn? I'm sorry, all the time. You're like, well,
I don't do math.
I'm probably the wrong one to ask on the fly for the math either. That's why I provided a tiny percentage.
Oh, there you go. All right, Bill. Well, I think I remember reading it was something like 40 million people. 40 million people. And that boggles the mind. And I could be wrong.
Heidi, one of the things that I would like to just say real quickly about that is when you think about the system that we've set up, we are allowing 18-year-olds to essentially borrow, and we allow them to borrow way more than we would allow them to borrow for a car or for a house. And the problem with that is when they don't actually end up with that degree, they can't sell what they got. And, like if they get a car and they default on that car loan, the car goes back. Mm-hmm. And as Bill was talking about, we don't allow those loans to basically be discharged. I think the other thing that has become very cumbersome and bureaucratic is we do have a national student loan forgiveness program. But I know people who have PhDs who can't figure out the paperwork in order to get their student loans forgiven. I also know people who maybe they did a refi way back when, and so now they're no longer eligible for that. And so there are a lot of different tricky maneuvers that have happened with the student loan process over the years. And I use the word tricky intentionally. Mm-hmm. I think we could be much more transparent with that process. But when we had private lenders who were making money on that process before we went back to the direct lending, I just think that we set students up to not be able to get out from under that debt burden.
Yeah. And tricky is right. There's a lot of, it's not in their best interest to make it easy to do. And so if they fall off, that's really happening. I have a question that before we move over to Bill to hear about some of the ways that you're approaching it and how you see the difference. Question from Ashley. What is the role that donors or the community can play in advocating for equitable post-secondary funding and more robust financial aid, more transparency about the real cost of post-secondary education?
Oh, well, some of the things we highlighted in our paper One of the things are around advocacy. I think that because like folks mentioned, part of the reason around the high cost of post-secondary education is kind of the balance in state and federal funding. And so I think that advocacy for organizations who are working to advance federal and state solutions that are going to try to subsidize some of these institutions and, provide borrowers' rights and legal protection for people so that they understand the situation that they're in as a borrower. And even before they make the choice to be a borrower, helping people fully understand what they're getting into, I think is a really important thing, because we've seen that people simply just don't know and they don't understand and they have trouble. And so I think advocacy in that way, even advocacy around the availability of scholarship and other non-loan aid grants, those would make a really big difference, I think, in kind of addressing this and the way that we looked at it in our paper. And also just to, help change the narrative around student debt and making sure that people are continuously up to date on the research and about the impact of student debt. I think that makes a really big difference.
Thank you. Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, there are a couple of other things that might be helpful in this regard. One is something that we've done with U.S. Spire, which is a nonprofit out of Boston, and New America, which is based in Washington, D.C., which is to regularize award letters. Every college can have its own award letter. And so when you're comparing the awards, it's not like comparing, for example, a loan document that says this is exactly how much you will owe, this is what the terms are. It all comes in a different way. So it's very difficult to compare those things evenly. So if you can have that change where all the financial aid information by the colleges was required to be provided in a uniform way, would make it easier for students when they're 18, when they're making these huge commitments, to say, gosh, maybe I shouldn't do this, or maybe I should do that. Another thing that is already, I think, on the table is Fafsa Reform. I have a high school senior, and I've been just completing Fafsa and CSS forms. These are not easy forms to complete. No. They are not user-friendly. The information that they're asking for is not clear. And frankly, it could be a lot clearer, if only because people really don't know what to put down. The other thing I think that's very helpful in terms of policy is that better outcomes data. Is a student like me likely to graduate from this college? And if so, how much debt am I going to have? Because a lot of students might be somewhat ambivalent about whether they go to state or the college of the so-and-sos. So they're trying to wonder, which college do I go to? Well, if they know that at this college, they have a 65% likelihood of graduating, but the other college has a 35% likelihood of graduating, then maybe they need to go to the school that's more likely to graduate them. And just so that they're making choices that are in their best interests. And, one of the challenges is that the colleges are eager to get you to enroll. They'd love to have you on campus. They'd love to have you contributing. They'd also love to have you paying tuition and fees. But you need to make those right choices. And often students are just not ready. And when we ask people, the single biggest debt in America after a mortgage is student debt. And to not have that clear to people when they're making those decisions is really not very fair.
That is when you talk about the fact that it is the largest debt after mortgage, if you think of what our economy is founded, it's founded on real estate, is backed by real estate. And that's the second one. That's, if we think about how we as a society have progressed, that home ownership has been the foundation of the American dream that we've come forward with since World War II. And so it almost seems as a society that education has supplanted that homeownership as the American dream, and we're starting to see that that kind of that bankrolling of that dream become a significant issue. So we've had a couple of solutions. I mean, Bill, you mentioned a couple of other institutions and some possibilities of creating unities for some of the very rather Byzantine application processes and communications that come together. And Dawn, you've mentioned also a couple of other ways to approach these different pieces. One of the questions that has come up, it's like Charles Desmond is asking, he says the rising cost of college attendance is a major factor that contributes to this problem. What can philanthropy do to help colleges pay their expenses without passing that cost on to students? So other ways that we might be able to mitigate some of this debt.
So I'm a huge fan of philanthropy, and I think that they do amazing things. But I think to rely on philanthropy to fix systemic problems that we have in our higher education system is not a sustainable choice. And so one of the things that I would talk about is working with philanthropy to elevate the message that education is an economic engine and driver for the economy at both the regional, state, and then also the national level. So we used to measure economic opportunity based on the number of buildings, the amount of land, public, in a city. Now we need to really be looking at economic opportunity as the number of educated folks in the populace of that city, because that's what attracts industry. That's what brings, people to your town to set up their businesses, their companies, and to do the work there. And so I think that's an incredibly important part. I also think that philanthropy can assist in building programs. We talked about Warrior Way Back. We have the Heart of Detroit in the city of Detroit, programs that allow us on a widespread basis to make a difference for students, whether or not they're going to individual institutions. And so making sure that information is out there, that it's accessible, that everybody knows that they have a path to higher education or a post-secondary credential. We've benefited a lot from the Kresge Foundation and others within the city of Detroit in amplification of that message, because as Bill said, institutions want to attract students. So sometimes students are skeptical if we share the message, but if it's a general message or it's shared with philanthropic partners or with business partners, we work very closely with the Detroit Chamber, then that message has a little more credence for students and they're able to listen a little bit more and take it. And so the amplification of the importance of a higher education degree, and then also as, making it easier for students to get that information and understand that information has been a huge part of what philanthropy can help us with.
I love that thought of, because now we're getting community voices in. If someone is amplifying that message, and if the message is clear, here is a path that you can follow that ends in credentials, not in dropping off, or if you fall off and you can't get back on, but it actually does have a conclusion that is something that will move you into that next step. I mean, if that's coming from, again, different voices in the community, and just going to take that to that next question of level. I mean, how does that bring our wide, diverse community voices into play? Have you seen examples of that happening in bringing those different messages?
I'll take that. We have seen that in the city of Detroit. We have seen and had amazing support from a lot of the faith leaders in our community, a lot of the community-based organizations. But I would speak and tell any institution, any state, any community-based organization that you have to walk the talk. So when we created the Warrior Way Back debt forgiveness program, Wayne State had to just literally wipe out some of that student debt. We had to show that we were there, that we were committed in order to gain the trust of the community. And I don't know how it is for other leaders in other cities, but I think a lot of people have come to Detroit to bring their solution and put it onto our community. And it's a lot more credible and your voice is a lot more authentic if you're actually in the community working on solutions and listening to the voices in your community when they tell you what they need. And that's how we shape our policy. That's how we shape our outlook on scholarships. Folks told us, I want to come to college, but I have this debt and I can't overcome it. And so we worked on a program for that. Or I want to go to college, but my family can't afford it. We worked on that. And so being able to hear those voices and elevate those privileged voices has really helped change and shape our policy.
And Bill and Raquan, are you seeing other kinds of community groups or community discussions that are informing or motivating different kind of attempts or changes in behavior or new programs to be built that you're keeping your eye on?
Well, I think that, part of it is doing research. And so the idea, it's not so much that philanthropy can step in and replace government or replace institutional policies. But what philanthropy can do is it can look around and see what are people saying? What are the challenges they're reporting? What are the concerns that they're showing? And is anybody fixing this? Is anybody innovating, like the Warrior Way Back program? So are they doing things that are really changing? And then having those conversations with local donors and also with national policymakers, so that these ideas are being fed both to institutions to change and also to policymakers. And so having survey data, I know that the Strata Foundation has worked with Gallup, for example, to see what employers are thinking and what ordinary students are thinking. So it's an approach of listening and also elevating voices, so that people are hearing about the challenges that are really concerning them.
Thank you. Raquan.
Sure. I was just going to jump in and in agreement with everything that's honestly been said. But really, I think that what we focus on, a lot of those things in terms of funding, the innovative pilot programs, that's a place for philanthropy to go. Programs like the Warrior Way Back program, which we also highlighted in our brief. And so I'm really excited to be on this panel today with Dawn. But we thought it was a really great one, looking at non-completers, like that was a huge barrier. So, hearing about the way that they listened to the needs of the community and then they developed a program to address that is huge. And philanthropy could fund more programs like that really get to the root of what are the barriers in a community or at a particular institution that are, impacting students' ability to successfully complete their education and then, receive the wage increases that they deserve from it. So we, in addition to funding the programs, we also talk about funding the associated program evaluation of those programs. I think that through tracking and evaluation of outcomes and metrics, you're really strengthening the evidence and the research base for why these type of programs make an impact, and they are important. So I think that that's a place for philanthropy to go to help continue to sponsor the research and sponsor the evaluation of these really innovative, very cool programs that could be replicated at scale across the country and at different places. They just need a little support to make sure that people the light is shown onto this issue and the consequences of inaction on this issue. And that really the ultimate metric of success that we look at is that they consider the impacts of the student loan burden on your household finances. So philanthropy, a lot of folks who are a funder are probably maybe not sure about the ways that student loan debt impacts the places they may traditionally make investments. So it might seem like student debt doesn't impact, this area that you're investing in, but it probably does. And taking that time to, like Dawn said, is to listen and hear from those who are experiencing it and thinking about how you can make the connection to your own investment is really important for philanthropy. But not, like many said, not a replacement for really broad systemic policy change, but definitely trying to make sure that the evidence base is refreshed, trying to make sure that evaluation is addressed and funded.
Great. And that ties right into, we have a question from Kristen, who is just again what we've just recently touched on. Her question is, are there examples or suggestions of philanthropic organizations doing larger policy organizing efforts to address these issues on a local or national level? We've got two wonderful examples here in our room today, which also have ties to many other, and you've mentioned a couple, going, but, is there a clearinghouse or a place that we can start to look? If we went to Kiva and we could, search under, student debt policy, would we find people doing this work? Or how would you suggest that we find different organizations that we can support?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I mean, there are some great policy organizations. The first one is the Institute for College Access and Success, TICAS. They really know basically the student debt environment and the borrowing environment and the public policy environment in Washington inside and out, and they increasingly have a presence in a variety of different states. I think the other thing, if you're looking for these sort of big policy approaches, you've got these ideas to change student debt, and the cost of college. So you've got things like college promise, the idea of giving free college to people within typically a specific geographic area. Detroit has one. Kalamazoo very famously has one. They're all over the country now. And this idea of, you can either reduce the debt or the impact of debt, or you can reduce the cost at the beginning, and then maybe make better choices or help people make choices that fit better for them. And so things like, supporting college promise and looking at free college. You could look at things like institutions getting together to improve student success so that when a student does get on campus, they are likely to graduate. And that would be things like the University Innovation Alliance or Achieving the Dream. Georgia State has famously done a great job with this. So there are ways in which you can look at other examples, and these are often invested in by large philanthropy. And that would be a way to look at it. The other side of this is, again, how do you change the institution? Traditionally, we said, let's make students college ready. Now what we're saying is, let's make colleges student ready. And so if you're getting students who have issues with hunger, who have issues with transportation, room and board, or who are at great risk for dropping out, what can you do to maybe support those students? Are there wraparound services that can be provided? Is there advising that can be made? And so these are the kinds of things that we typically are seeing and supporting.
That's great. It sounds like there's a wealth of information and different ways to approach being done. So you just kind of want to keep your eyes open and look for the atypical and see how that's really supporting the whole. Thank you. Speaking of larger kind of policy efforts, we have a question or at least a comment from Bahar. And she's talking about navigating student loan repayment plans and dealing with servicers whose interests are not necessarily aligned with those of the borrowers, and that creates an amplified problem. Enacting strong student loan borrowers' Bill of Rights should also be part of the solution. But tied together with that student loan borrowers' Bill of Rights, we need to have more systemic solutions to solve the student debt crisis. And it is a crisis level. Go ahead.
So one of the things, going back to what Bill said about less cost on the front end, I think that's incredibly important. And we do need to have those standard letters, because a lot of times we will see students who have received larger scholarships or grants at more expensive institutions, and they don't understand what their bottom line cost will be. Or they will make an assumption that tuition and fees includes housing dollars. So a lot of first generation students don't necessarily know how to college. And so that is part of the movement, that colleges need to be ready and be able to explain things in a simpler and more systematic way for students. Because one of the things that struck me is students are most likely to go and seek advice about college from their parents. And if their parents didn't go to college, but yet are giving advice about things, students can quickly end up in a situation where they may not realize, what they were doing, or they may have taken advice from parents who maybe didn't have the full picture. And so I do think less cost is one of them. I also think higher education, and especially a large number of private institutions, have not really done a good job of using our dollars to help fund students. And so we can actually flip the model of financial aid, where a student would get a Pell Grant and then maybe a supplemental educational grant, any merit aid from an institution, and then the institution can gap fill for tuition and fees. And we could be sending a lot more students to college with zero out-of-pocket costs. And it's just simply something that I think financial aid officers haven't really been the policy drivers at institutions. But we could do this and really open up the doors for a lot more students to attend higher education with zero out-of-pocket fees. We're doing it at Wayne State, and it's still a positive net tuition revenue for the institution, but students aren't having to incur that debt for their tuition and fees.
Wow, it's like almost pinch me, Dawn. What you just described is almost an idealistic world that I would love to, be a member of at some point. How close are we to actually seeing something like that happen? I hear what you're saying, that you're doing it, you're proving the model, you're saying that it can work. How do you see that? How do you see that being magnified, or how do you see that kind of model being enacted elsewhere? And what do you think the timeline is for reaching utopia?
I think institutions just have to want to do it. And that's the thing. So we're doing it. This year, we did it for 569 freshmen out of our 3,100 freshman class. We would have done it for more if they had qualified for it. So, but it is completely possible. And a lot of enrollment managers, when I talked to them, they were like, oh, how can you do this? And I was like, call me. We can walk you through it. It's not difficult. But you have two siloed operations where you have a recruitment operation and you have a financial aid operation. I just happen to have been the person who grew up in financial aid as well as admissions. And so I have an understanding of that world, but we could do it. I mean, for a huge chunk of students, my hope is that Michigan as a state, that we can take it to that next level and be an exemplar for the rest of the nation. You know,
what Dawn has just said too, we've seen another pattern, which is emergency grants and what are called completion grants. And the Warrior Way Back program is kind of a completion grant, but it's really an attraction grant. But these completion grants are, and Georgia State has famously done them, but they've been done at other places, is they typically look at juniors or seniors and they say, this student's already doing well, they're okay, but they didn't re-enroll. And so what's going on? And typically there's a gap, and a lot of students get to a certain point and they say, I have borrowed too much money. I need to work for a couple of years and I'll go back. But often it's because they don't have, say, $1,000 or $1,800. That's the gap between their financial aid package and what they owe the college. So what Georgia State does famously with its Panther grants is they just write off that $1,500 or $1,800 and the student can come. And it's exactly what Dawn is talking about. It says the basic question, and you have to explain this to a lot of people, but would you rather get, say, for $10,000 need that you need from a student to enroll, would you rather get $9,000 from a student because they've got a Pell Grant and they've got some other student aid, or would you rather get zero because they can't afford that little bit at the end? And so most of them, if they think about it, well, right, I'd rather get $9,000 because not only do this institution get more revenue, but the student is more likely to graduate, which makes it more attractive to other students and makes the institution look better in various reports and comparisons. And so, this rethinking about how they actually support students by looking at this kind of information is really critical.
That ties into a question that we have from Gabe, which we started to touch on, but Gabe says we found that other costs, books, living expenses, travel expenses that students incur while in school beyond tuition also contribute to dropout and vulnerability. How else are you seeing those needs being addressed beyond what we've shared with a little bit today?
Well, as Bill was talking about, at Wayne State, we have the completion grants. We also have the student emergency fund that takes care of some of those additional things. So when you're a student, a long time ago when I was a student, a Pell Grant and a student loan and a summer job basically covered my expenses. And I would work a little bit while I was in school, 10 to 15 hours a week. Now we're seeing students that even if they get all of that support, it still, maybe comes up to tuition, but sometimes not always. And so those additional costs like books and those types of things can be really expensive. So we're looking at a lot of open access textbooks. I think that's something that many of us will remember when we were in college were very, very expensive. I was an English major, and I remember my mom just, cringing over the amount of money that I spent on books each semester. But if we can do open access textbooks, or we can have faculty members make those choices, then students don't have to pay that much out of pocket, or if they can rent their textbooks. And so those are really, great ways to help support students. Also allowing students to live at home and commute to institutions, maybe commute to community colleges for 2 years, and then they can make a transfer to a 4-year. So you have reverse transfer agreements, you have articulation agreements so that every class maps into another class so there's no lost credit. All of those programs, I think, really help students make good financial choices, kind of going back to what Bill was talking about the full transparent cost in those award letters. Just giving students all the information they need in language that they can understand.
So, I'm sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just going to just jump in and say that, one other thing that we definitely think about is how to focus on the students who are low income and facing the most financial vulnerability. Like those are likely to be the same students who are going to be facing that, that gap and that difficulty in paying for some of the costs and expenses outside of tuition. So, those students, like many said, the award letter says one thing, but the true cost can be another. So focusing on those households and those students, and also making sure that the funding that students receive is consistent and adequate for their needs. So really, that's a part of the other thing about doing the research and finding out like what are the needs of today's students. So making sure that the amount of available grant funding is appropriate and what students actually need to get through a degree, and then also supporting those emergency and completion grants. Unexpected expenses or financial challenges happen. That's like a natural part of life, but the problem is when they become a barrier to completion, forcing students to drop off. So those are kind of the things that we also think about in designing or promoting a solution, is addressing the most vulnerable people, and that really has an eye towards, I think, short and long-term racial wealth gap, addressing the disparities. You can also see that by making investment in this place, Black and Brown students and more vulnerable students would be benefited greatly to this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dawn, just listening to the Warrior Way Back and re-enrollment and student debt forgiveness, and how can you set a program to succeed for students in an institution, and thinking about some of these different barriers that Raquan was just mentioning, what would you, if you were to reflect back, what would you say that you've learned about your students in this program? And what have you learned about your institution as this program has evolved?
So as she was talking, I was thinking about, I'm a huge basketball fan, and so March Madness is coming up. And you think about institutions that really want to be athletic powerhouses, they put their money there. And so if you are truly an institution that cares about diversity and access and inclusion and opportunity, that's where you're going to put your money, that's where you're going to put your time. And by creating programs, what I've learned about my institution is that Wayne State University really is in the heart of Detroit, and we really are committed to the success of Detroit and to the success of Detroit's citizens and its students. And so that has been a really important thing that I have learned. I have also learned that there are institutions who say that they want those things, but they're not necessarily shifting or really looking or really listening to the communities of Black and Brown students to figure out what they need. And so that has probably been one of the biggest and best things that I've learned, is that I can take the passion that I have for access for students, I can apply it at an urban serving research institution, and I can actually help affect change. And so that's been amazing for me. It's been amazing for my institution. And I hope that the city of Detroit will reap the benefits from that. And I think that any institution can truly commit to that and truly make that decision. It is truly how you fund your strategic goals and your strategic vision. Wayne State, we are never going to be a Division I, gymnastics national champion, because we're a Division II school. But if we wanted to be that and we wanted to set our sights on that, then we would divert our resources there. That's what we're doing with this, to create access and opportunity.
Right. And I love that theme, diverting the resources to create what your vision is. That's a great way to think about it. Bill, what have you learned about your organization and the folks that it serves?
Well, I think that what we're finding is that there is a lot of innovation out there, and that people are doing things. And I think that we're discovering that what used to be seen as immutable truths, some students just can't succeed, and that's just the way it is. And we need to have certain standards or practices, and these are the practices that we developed in the 1950s, and they're still the right practices today. I think what we're finding out is that there are innovative institutions, including Wayne State and others, that are trying their very best to be more appropriate for the 21st century, more supportive of the students they get, figuring out ways to support their students in a way that was completely different than it might have been 50 years ago. And I think that's, to me, very appealing, because in fact, the innovators and the reformers are succeeding. It's not just pie in the sky. They are actually seeing real change. And I think that's really critically important. I think the same thing, too, about these national policy issues about student debt. It is all about national priorities. And just to put it there, do we want it to be about the wealthiest among us having lower taxes? Or would we like to have more affordable educational opportunities for most Americans so that they can prosper in the 21st century? And so, frankly, so that the country as a whole can prosper. These are just priorities. We have to decide what is more important. I know where I sit on these issues, but I think it's not impossible to change things. We can make a country that is providing more opportunity for low-income people and people who've been traditionally disadvantaged in our society so that they can meet their biggest and most important goals, and that our society can be more just and more prosperous.
Right, and that rising tide will raise all of our ships. That is that hopeful message, and I think that's the work that we are all dedicated towards doing. Thank you. Any closing thoughts from us, Raquan, as we come towards the end of our time together, as we wrap up? And thank you, Bill, for ending on such a hopeful note with the forward thinking. We talked about growing community and really, really having that community identity and how all the players come together. Thank you, Don, for closing that and showing us the possibility on the national level, Bill, of having that same kind of identity. So, Raquan, where does this work take you now into the future, and how are you are looking towards that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing I'll just kind of leave with saying is that I know student loan cancellation is a big topic, and a lot of folks are hearing about that in the news and as a policy priority for the current administration. And so I would just, challenge everyone to think about, even if cancellation happens and it provides relief for a lot of borrowers, which is really great, the problem is still there. Higher education is still expensive, and we're still going to be, we'll still depend on some real reform that will impact the high cost of education and the need that people have to take out debt. Some people are even suggesting that without the reforms, more people will take on debt, and people might even be more likely to take on debt with the hope of cancellation. So we don't want to dig ourselves into that hole by suggesting that. So I would just say that even if cancellation seems to be on the horizon, there still needs to be major reforms. But like Bill and Don said, it's happening. We are seeing it. Our paper highlighted a bunch of really cool solutions that we are seeing, both systemically and kind of on the individual borrower. From my perspective, at Aspen Financial Security Program, I sit on our policy and market solutions team. So I am looking at both policy and the market solution. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting employer-based solutions. We're seeing employers realize this is a way to get talent. This is a way to get diversity in our workplace. So trying to optimize and suggest this is a way that you could be a better employer. In your benefits that you give to your employees, student debt, this could be something. So, and that's been really encouraging to see. So I think there's also an opportunity for well-vetted fintech and things like that. So there's a lot of really cool investment happening, and I would encourage you all to have a look at the paper and dig deep. There's a lot of really great resources there. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Raquan, and you've done a wonderful job. And thank you, everyone who's been joining us today live and who will be joining us on our replay. And as you can see, the student debt crisis is not something that we're going to solve overnight, but we've got some really good traction, some great options that are happening. And as Bill and Raquan and Don have shown, lots of innovation that's really happening in the world. And through our joint work, it's an issue that we can continue to chip away and solve together. So thank you again, Bill Moses, Raquan Wedderburn, Dr. Don Medley, thank you so much. We are so grateful for your time and your insights here today. Would you take a moment, Bill, can you share with us how we could find and connect with you?
Sure. Please go ahead and visit us at www.kresge.org and look at the education team, or you can follow us on Twitter at KresgeDU, or follow me at Bill Moses on Twitter.
All right. Thank you, Raquan. What's the best way and the best location to find you?
Sure. You could find out more about me and my program, Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program, by visiting aspeninstitute.org/financial security program.
And Dawn, how would we get a hold of the report that you've been talking about?
The report that I've been talking about?
I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Sure. So it's you'll go to the assetfunders.org.
Thank you. And Dawn, how do we find you and connect and get in touch with you?
Dawn.medley at wayne.edu. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find. You can Google it.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for joining us today. I really enjoyed our time together, and I'm looking forward to seeing how some of these pieces really evolve over the next bit of time, especially this year. Like you said, there's a lot going on. You were hearing a lot about it. There's going to be some administrative issues that come down from the federal level. So it's a really good time to keep an eye on these things. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Until next month, keep up that good fight for more inclusive and equitable access to higher education. We'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye.